heart doesn't work, the myocardial infarct. Some diseases of the system, atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis begins in youth, but its consequences are not apparent until middle to old age. Women before age 45 have less atherosclerosis than men because of a positive effect of estrogen. It enhances the nitric oxide production. It inhibits the endothelial release. It blocks the voltage gates calciums. It upregulates the LDLs, it speeds up the regulation of the LDLs, and it increases the production of the HDLs. Hypertension, or age and their effects. Hypertension after age 40, single most common cause of sudden cardiovascular death in men ages 40 to 50. Effects of technology. Remember we said technology was like a two-edged sword? Because it keeps us from working hard and getting the exercise, but at the same time the technology and the health care side of it is getting better, so we are more likely to survive the events that we get. The lymphatic system, two semi-independent parts that work together, a network of lymphatic vessels and the lymphoid tissues and organs. We talked about the function of the lymphatic system. It returns plasma left in the interstitial fluid back to the blood vascular system. When it's in the lymphatic system, we call it lymph. When it was in the blood vascular system, we call it plasma. Lymphatic vessels closely resemble veins. Lymphatic vessels closely resemble veins. We get lymph by draining interstitial fluid from the tissues. We get lymph by draining interstitial fluid. The lymph returns to the blood vascular system at the subclavian veins. Lymphedema, collection of fluid in the tissues because of blockage of those lymphatic vessels. The blocked lymphatic can come from tumors or surgical removal like mastectomy. Immobilization can lead to it. Immobilization of the extremities increases the amount of lymph in the interstitial fluid. The lymphoid cells, the cells of the lymphatic system, lymphocytes, B's and T's, and macrophages. Lymphocytes, B's and T's, and they are macrophages. The lymphoid tissues house and provide a proliferation site for lymphocytes and a surveillance sites for the lymphoid cells. The lymphoid organs include the lymph nodes, the spleen, and the thymus. The lymph nodes filter lymph. They contain those phagocytic cells to remove and destroy the bacteria and the antigens that we know now. The lymph nodes had a structure. They were encapsulated, bean-shaped. They had a cortex that was densely packed follicles with lots of B cells and a medullary cords that extend from the cortex, and they contain the lymphocytes and plasma cells. The other lymphoid organs, the spleen does not filter lymph, it filters blood. The thymus fills the mediastinum and the neck. It functions predominantly in childhood. T cells mature in the thymus. T cells mature in the thymus. Thymus also produces a couple of hormones, thymopoietin and thymosin. The tonsils, rings of lymphatic tissues. They are not nodes. There were some aggregates of lymphoid tissue, galt tissue in the gastrointestinal area and malt tissue in the bronchi and the respiratory areas. Non-specific body defenses. Remember we talked about this? It was those barriers, the skin and the mucosa, the things that are there all the time. There were some non-specific cells and chemical defenses, the phagocytes or macrophages. These guys go out in circulating tissues, and the neutrophils are also phagocytes. They go out and engulf particulate and destroy it. The NKs, natural killer cells. lice and kill cancer cells and virally infected cells before the immune system is activated. The NKs are large granular lymphocytes. Inflammation. The inflammatory response prevents the spread of damaging agents to the nearby tissues. It disposes of cellular debris and pathogens, and it sets the stage for tissue repair. There are cardinal signs of inflammation: redness, heat, swelling, and pain. Most of those can be attributed to vasodilation. That vasodilation causes increased vascular permeability. Some of those inflammatory chemicals are released. Remember, the most important were histamines, kinins, prostaglandins, complement, and the lymphokines. All of them promote vasodilation. Phagocyte mobilization. Remember leukocytosis? Remember what leukocytosis was? When the white blood cells have the ability, leukodiopedesis, have that ability to go outside of the circulation and move out into the tissues. There were some antimicrobial proteins. Complement. Complement, once it's fixated, leads to cell lysis. Once the entire activation of the complex is activated, it leads to cell lysis, destruction of the cell. Interferon, a protein secreted by virally infected cells that protect the uninfected cell. Fever. Mild to moderate fever is an adaptive response. It reduces the zinc and iron in circulation that the bacteria need to grow. It also changes that thermocline that we talked about. All bugs have a thermocline that they can live in, and most of the bugs that affect us, if we just raise the body temperature 2 or 3 degrees, they can't handle it. Specific body immunity. The specific or the non-specific was always ready to respond. The specific defenses have to meet the enemy and be primed before they can respond. Immunology, the study of immunity, it had 3 aspects: specificity, systemic, and memory. All 3. Humoral or antibody-mediated immunity, still specific, provided by the antibodies that circulate in the blood and lymph. An antigen is our enemy. An antigen is a substance that stimulates an immune response. There were complete antigens and there were haptens. Haptens were incomplete. Haptens give us allergies. We looked at antigenic determinants. Remember, that was the binding sites where the antigens could bind. And self-antigens, MHCs, major histocompatibility complexes. MHCs give us self-tolerance. The cells of the immune system were antigen-presenting cells, APCs, the B lymphocytes, and the T lymphocytes. All of the lymphocytes originate in the red bone marrow from the hemocytoblast, the stem cell of all of the formed elements. Those lymphocytes mature into B cells or T cells. B cells mature in the bone marrow. T cells mature in the thymus. Y'all go have a bunch of We're going to wait a second. APCs, antigen-presenting cells, engulf foreign particulate, and they present that antigenic determinant to the cells for recognition. Antigen-presenting cells. The humoral immune response. The antigenic challenge, the first contact between the B cells and that antigen, usually occurs in the lymph nodes or in the spleen, but it can happen in any of that lymphatic tissue. Clonal selection of the B cells. B cells are activated by the attachment of that antigen. They then clone themselves at a rate of 2,000 per second for 4 or 5 days. After the war is over, some of them become memory cells that can remain with us for the rest of our life. There is active and passive humoral immunity. Active immunity is when you have the disease and you produce memory cells. Naturally acquired when you have the disease. Artificially acquired is when you get a vaccine. Then there's passive immunity. We borrow antibodies. We have no memory cells, and this is when mom gives her antibodies to babe. The antibodies have a structure. They are a protein produced by the body in response to a foreign substance entering the body. We looked at cell-mediated immunity. The B cells respond to an antigen directly. T cells can only respond if they have a processed fragment on that antigen. T cell activation. Remember, we had to activate our T cells to get our immune response? And there was 3 things necessary for us to activate the T cells. The binding of that antigen, co-stimulation, where we have more than one binding site, and then we have to have an antigen-presenting cell. Step 1, step 2, and an APC. Co-stimulation was required for the proliferation of cloning of those T cells. Specific T cell roles, the helper T. The helper T guy has the central role in the immune response. Remember, we called him the hornblower. He calls all the other immune cells to the site of infection. The helper T, the regulatory cell. T cell mobilization and immune cells with macrophages, they attract other cells and white blood cells to amplify the nonspecific responses. There were some cytotoxic T cells, almost like those killer Ts that we had in the nonspecific, the NKs. The NKs do a similar thing as the cytotoxic Ts. They roam the tissue looking for, in the case of NKs, anything, but in the case of cytotoxic T cells, a specific antigen. There were some other T cells, suppressor T cells, that regulate or control our immune response. Delayed hypersensitivity cells, believed to be a subclass of helper Ts. Helper Ts, critical to the immune response. No helper Ts, no immune response. We talked about transplants. Autografts, we get tissue from same, get it from my butt. Isografts, get my tissue from my identical twin. Allograft, I get my tissue from some other person. And xenograft, I get my tissue from another species. Autos and isos, ideal donors, usually successful. Homeostatic imbalances, immunodeficiencies, like SIDS, both B's and T's are involved. The autoimmune diseases, myasthenia gravis, multiple sclerosis, Graves' disease, type 1 diabetes, systemic lupus erythematosus, glomerulonephritis, and rheumatoid arthritis. All of those are autoimmune conditions. The hypersensitivities and allergies. Remember our immediate type 1 acute hypersensitivity? That's the guy like the shellfish or the peanut reaction, peanut guy. These guys, really, really severe, lead to anaphylaxis, only last a very short time. Come on really quickly, don't last but an hour or two. So hypersensitivity type 1, acute. Then there was subacute hypersensitivity, slower onset. Takes an hour to 3 hours, but it takes 10 to 13 hours to clear. Cytotoxic type 2 guys, antibodies bind to antigens on the body cells, stimulating the phagocytosis. These were transfusion reactions. Immunocomplex type 2 hypersensitivity, that was the long-term guy. That was the moldy hay and the farmers and those guys. Delayed hypersensitivity. Delayed hypersensitivity is not an antibody activity. It is contact dermatitis. That was our poison oak, poison sumac, and poison ivy. Immunology, laughter is the best medicine. Okay, you guys good? I am done. We're 30 minutes early. Next week after our test, we're going to move on into the respiratory system. It's kind of fun.
Thanks.